The Bike Club podcast is a collaboration between Beth Curran and Akshaya Parthasarathy.
The Bike Club podcast acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land we record on. We pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging.
Welcome to Bike Club, a tech podcast crafted by the girls for the girls. Our mission to elevate, educate, and explore the exciting world of technology.
So tune in and remember, the first rule of Bike Club is to talk about Bike Club.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode. I'm very excited about this one for a couple of reasons, because as you all know, Beth and I, we don't discuss the person that we're profiling and the topics that we're doing. But coincidentally, we happen to choose something related to physics as well as a woman or like a Shiro from our respective home countries this time.
Oh, no way!
Yeah, I know.
Is your person also from your...
No, yeah,
Not your
like
home
from
city.
India. Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah, and you chose someone from Sydney for the last one. So it was,
Yeah.
I found that very fascinating, where
That's
we
so
must
interesting.
be linked in the brain to some extent.
Yeah. We have quantum entanglement of our brains.
Oh my God,
There we go, throw back to the last episode.
Don't.
We just recorded it, guys. We're recording 2 in a row, so our brains are probably already
Yeah, I'm just
tired.
trying to get over the
Actually, I was like, flashbacks.
So
Right.
before I jump into my report, do you want to give us the rule, Beth?
Yes, I will. My rule for this episode of Bite Club is don't be afraid to forge your own path.
Ooh.
To me, this is about I know when I was looking at my career trajectory, I will often look up what's the career path, or look at what other people have done and be like, okay, so these are the steps that I have to do to do X, Y, Z, and I
Yeah.
and so I'm someone who likes to have a very structured plan. I like to have
Yep.
kind of instructions of you gotta do this and you gotta do this and you gotta do this.
Yep.
And I think it can be good. It can be good to get a general idea of how do I move into this profession, or how do I pursue this thing? That's all fine. But I think in the past it's kind of hindered me when things haven't gone that way, and then I've been oh no, what am I gonna do? But actually, all of these successful women that we've looked at have had their own unique paths, right? There's not two people who are on exactly the same road. And often their success comes when they go, actually, I'm interested in this thing and this thing.
Yeah.
How might they fit together, or how might those things work together? And they kind of, they make their own pathway, and it leads to really great things. So I guess as much as it's good to get kind of some guidance from someone who's a bit further on, also don't be scared if your path looks different to other people's. If you come in through a different route, or if you take a different turn, or if you accept an opportunity that you thought you didn't expect to accept, So that's my rule. Don't be afraid to forge your own path, because you never know where it might lead.
I love that, because I think for the past couple of weeks, I've been a victim to just comparing my career path to just others. And
it's so easy to do.
Yeah. And it's just, I don't know whether it's just the current generation and how much on social media we're all on, how much we get to see of other people's lives. And it's so easy to picture yourself in that, and you're like, oh, if this person did this X thing by the age of 29, that means I need to get this.
Why have I not done that?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So you put yourself on this unreasonable time.
Yeah, we see our own, low lights, and we see everyone else's highlight reel, and it's easy to be why does my path not look like that? But their path doesn't even look like that. That's what they're presenting, and I think it can be so easy to be well, I've got to do it this way. It just causes you to miss out on the things that you are achieving, and on the amazing, unique journey that you have. If you're constantly oh, it should look like this, or comparing yourself, you miss out on all the things that you're bringing
to the table. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. That's a nice one. I need to put that into practice myself. Okay. Well, thanks, Beth. So for today's episode, I'm going to be focusing on Ritu Karidhal Srivastava, or popularly known as the Rocket Woman of India.
Ooh.
Yeah. So no surprises there. It's going to be about space. And I'm stepping a little out of my comfort zone over here, because I'm going to be explaining about physics, a little bit of a physicsy, spacey concept. So
Don't worry, no judgment here.
disclaimers, everything. I'm probably not going to get it right, but I'm going to try my best as possible.
Sorry, before you start, you know what's so funny is that we're always like, have confidence in yourself, be strong, amazing women. And then every time we do a
I'm going to
report,
be a
we're both like,
mistake. I'm
we're
going
both
to
like,
make
we're gonna get it
mistakes.
wrong. Don't listen to her. Like,
Yeah.
it's just so funny. Anyway,
I
sorry.
know
I think those are
nothing.
helpful disclaimers, but it is funny that we're like, yeah, confident women, and then we're like, I don't know, I don't want to get it
I'm
wrong.
not confident.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
You should be, but I'm not.
Good for you. You choose it.
Yeah, you go, girl. All right, sorry. Continue.
Okay.
I'm sure you'll do great.
Okay. So, Ritu Karidhal Srivastava was involved in India's first Mars orbiter mission, which was called Mangalyaan. That quite literally mean Mars vehicle. Yeah, in like the translated term. And it was a really successful one because it was the first country to ever get it right the first time, the
Yeah.
landing and the orbiting and everything. And Ritu played a very important role in making that happen. So she's an Indian scientist and an aerospace engineer who hails from the city of Lucknow, Uttar Pradesh. She's done her bachelor's degree and a master's degree from the University of Lucknow in physics. And then she had a small stint as a research scholar at the same university before she decided to join the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore to pursue her master's in aerospace engineering. As a child, this was the path that she just often found herself kind of fantasizing about. So apparently she was this teenager who was curious about space, often ran outside her home, looked up at the sky, studied how the moon looked through different transitions. And quite similar to you, she also had like a good old collection of articles and just cut out of those articles, which whenever they mentioned anything related to NASA or ISRO, which is the Indian Space Research Organization. So she had the whole fangirl phase going. But she eventually found herself working at ISRO in 1997. And specifically for the Mars orbiter mission, she was the deputy operations director. She had a very successful career at ISRO. I believe she was given an award by the president itself at that time, the president of India, Abdul Kalam. He gave her an award sometime in 2007 for her work. And she was a very accomplished lady. Like she knew what she was doing and she was just, she was just really good with her work in space. Over her career, she's worked on multiple different things. The Mars orbiter mission was one of them, and that was in 2013. But then, even since then, she's also been part of a lot of the lunar missions and like the lunar satellite missions that India has sent out. So she's just touched base on all of them. So the Mars orbiter mission was ISRO's first ever attempt to basically go beyond Earth. And the primary objective of this mission was that they developed the right kind of tech for designing, planning, management, as well as the operations of this interplanetary course that they were going to take. And then their second objective was basically that once this satellite manages to get onto Mars, it would be collecting details about its atmosphere, reading all the kind of information that is necessary for them to get to know more about Mars as the planet. And while also making sure that they do this by using the indigenous scientific instruments. It's absolutely not a small feat. This was an extremely ambitious project. And the reason that it was very important to get it right was because, when a satellite leaves Earth and then goes past Earth's gravity, it's very difficult for the comms to remain at the same speed or the same connectivity because
Get more
the
and more
further
delay.
further the distance, more the delay, and that could mean literally anything.
Yeah.
It would essentially have to be autonomous to some extent, quite literally like a self-driving car. It has to be intelligent as well, so that between that time that it orbits out of Earth into space and then makes its way to Mars, whatever problems that it would come across, it should have the capabilities to face it on its own. This is where Ritu came in because she was given the task of quite literally designing the autonomous brain, or rather the spacecraft autonomy system. So I think to break it down, it would be with the same example of the self-driving car. Now, a self-driving car is an autonomous system because you program it in a way that, okay, if there's a person crossing, don't speed, just stop, or take a
Yep.
left turn at when it's indicated left, and just, the certain decisions and the tasks that it's supposed to do as a car. In a similar way, we have a spacecraft designed with an autonomous brain where it is also supposed to make decisions and perform certain functions without really waiting for instructions to come from the space center. So
Yep.
Ritu had to make sure that this satellite could operate independently on its own. And for a space system, this could mean a lot of different tasks. It could be about what if something went wrong with one of its sensors? Or what if something came along its path? What path is it supposed to take? Like the trajectory that it's supposed to pursue, anything from collecting data, anything to its own, like identifying whether its battery levels are down or whether the temperature is too different, absolutely anything and everything. So this was like a massive task, right? And she understood it. There was this article that I read, a little profile that one of the news companies did, and she said that I had to ensure that it was all executed without any flaw or anomaly. When it comes to launching spacecraft, the slightest anomaly can spell disaster, especially in the case of maneuvers and mass orbit insertions. So every single detail had to be thoroughly vetted. This was no small task, like I said. And I think another thing that was very challenging throughout this time, despite the long hours that she already had put into this mission, was the fact that she was a family woman. So she had two kids. They were well into like their early years of school, and it came with the side of responsibilities that she had to perform as a mom as well, because they were getting sick, and they had to be given that certain care. But I also read in that article that she said she had a lot of support from her husband at that time, who said, you know what, you go ahead, you do what you want. I'm going to take care of this. This shouldn't be something that you should be worried about. Anyway, so Ritu worked her nights and her days, and she had this fabulous team with her that ultimately made Mangalyaan, or the Mars Orbiter mission, a very successful one. The reason that it was super successful was because it cost a fraction of what it took NASA to do the same. So NASA got this done at somewhere around 600 million USD. Like they got the satellite up orbiting and collecting data about Mars. Whereas the entire Mars orbiter mission only cost 74 million. And to put that into context, do you know that movie Gravity with Sandra Bullock?
Yeah.
And that cost 100 million.
Yeah, wow. So it costs less
yeah,
than the
so
movie.
yeah, it costs less to send a satellite to space than it costs to
That's kind of
a
hilarious.
movie about space. Yeah. So this was a massive, it was just so well done. And it was a huge feat because it was also the first, India also then became like the first Asian nation to ever achieve this. And the reason that it took so less of a cost has got a great deal to do with the amount of fuel that was used. So they really optimized the trajectory. And Ritu plays a huge role in this because she planned out, she was basically the director that was planning out the trajectory of the spacecraft and what it's supposed to take. And it has something to do with a concept called Hohmann transfer orbit, which I'm going to get to in like the next section because it talks about orbital mechanics, and it's a very yeah, it's a very interesting concept and how it helps to basically save the fuel. But Ritu ensured that her deep understanding of orbital mechanics came into play when executing the trajectory and the operations. They also had quite a few, I would say, challenges between the initial time that the rocket was supposed to be launched. They had a few delays because they witnessed storms over the Pacific Ocean, and
Mm.
this didn't subside until somewhere around, I think, the next week. So they were all okayed by 4th November. And the interesting thing about the Hohmann transfer orbit is that it has to be done in a certain time period because it has to do with like the positions of
Yeah.
the Earth, the moon, and like Mars and everything.
Yes. That's always the fun thing with space.
Yeah,
Everything's moving.
exactly. Nothing ever stays in the same position that it's supposed to do. So again, huge pressure on her because only the world is watching.
Mm.
But anyways, I guess the stars were quite literally in their in alignment for them because on 4th November they were back on track and they were able to send the satellite out into space and it was great. So yeah, so that's a little bit about Ritu. She's since the success of Mangalyaan, she's been involved in two other missions, as I mentioned. So Chandrayaan 2 and Chandrayaan 3 were the lunar exploration missions executed by ISRO. And Chandrayaan 3 was even more of a bigger achievement because it made India like the first ever country to land on the dark side of the moon or the southern pole.
Mm.
So she played again like a huge role in this. And she was rightfully recognized for it because she's been invited to several TEDx conferences since then. I link some of these. She's so like as you mentioned with like our previous like with Michelle, she's so down to earth. She feels like she's
Mm.
approachable. Like you could just talk to her about everything. I linked the video in the description. Yeah, and she was also recognized for her for her doctorate. So the University of Lucknow gave her an honorary doctorate in her field. And she also had a very cool award, which was that at the 47th G7 summit, Karidhal was then appointed to this newly formed Gender Equality Advisory Council. So that was a first, and that was a pretty big thing. So yeah, she was a very fascinating lady. And what I love most about her, besides, that she's got this all-rounder aspect that she's killing it at. But the mission itself, like the Mars Orbiter mission, what makes it so special, even beyond its technical achievements, was the fact that about 27% of the key executive positions for that mission were held by women. So that was like
Mm.
almost 8 seats at the table. So Ritu had like 7 other women that were expertise in this field, and they were all just sitting together and made this a massive success. And I love that. So
Yeah,
yeah.
that's awesome.
Yeah. So that was a little bit about Ritu. She's currently still working with ISRO. Can't wait to see what other missions she gets to be a part of and what more she gets to achieve. But I'll get into explaining the Hohmann transfer orbit at the best I can in the next section. So yeah.
Cool.
Back on topic with Ritu Karidhal and the Mars Orbiter mission. We are now going to be diving into a little bit of orbital mechanics. This is completely foreign ground for me. So I really hope all the YouTube lectures that I watched, pay off just a
I mean,
bit.
that's how I got my physics degree, so
Oh
I'm sure
yeah,
you'll be fine.
YouTube.
Yeah.
That's how I got my comp sci degree, all of
Yeah.
YouTube.
Yeah.
As I mentioned, the Mars Orbiter mission was very cheap, right? And
Mm.
a great deal of this had to do with, well, basically the algorithms that they had in place and the calculations that they had done to ensure that the transfer orbits that they are taking works out well in their favor. I'll get a little bit into this transfer orbit, but just before that, of course, like considering cost, there are a lot of factors that come into place. This one is the concept that I'm about to teach, of course, is important. But the other factor I would say, which also contributed to the cost, was just how lightweight the rocket itself is. Many factors like, the weight and the payload that you send into space come into play. Amongst them is the fact that they wanted to basically make use of Hohmann transfer orbit in order to get the satellite from Earth into Mars. And even
And was
before
this, sorry,
yeah, sorry.
was this like, were they landing stuff on Mars? Were they landing a rover or something, or was it just
Pretty
an
much,
orbit
yeah.
of Mars?
They needed this rover to like get there on Mars because it was going to study different kinds of just different aspects of Mars and just life on Mars. They
Yeah.
had all kinds of sensors that would start to read things. One of the most important aspect I read was about studying methane. Apparently, there's
Mhm.
this space rumor on how Mars has methane producing bugs, and they wanted to
Mhm.
really get down to like the bottom of it. So yeah, this is something that
Yep.
has to land on Mars, right?
Yep.
So now we know that everything in orbit, or at least within our solar system, everything in space, our solar system has an orbit. And an orbit's
Mhm.
nothing except just the fact that if it's a regular repeating path or a pattern that an object in space takes, well, that's it. So that's an orbit. So we have the Earth orbiting around the sun, and then the moon orbits around us, and then the other planets orbit around the sun as well. And all that happens is just in like circles and circles and circles. Now, I say circles, but based off of Kepler's laws in planetary motion, the first ever law states that each planet's orbit around the sun is an ellipse. An ellipse, as we know, is basically just a stretched out circle, as we were just
Yep.
discussing. So it looks like an oval, right?
Mhm.
So this means that the planet to sun distance would greatly differ while it is in motion.
Mhm.
Sometimes there would be parts where it's like closer to the sun, and then some other times it would just get stretched out, and then it would be like further away from the sun. And that happens with like within the planets themselves. These
Mhm.
ellipses or the orbits that they take would sometimes make the the planets come a little bit closer to one another, and then
Mhm.
it would just stretch out way further in the back. Now we're talking about this in like light years, right? So
Yeah.
this is this it could take anywhere between I think the best case scenario was basically what they had achieved for the Mars orbiter mission, which was around a matter of months, like 7 to 10
Mhm.
months, as opposed to, I don't know, like 37 years by the time if they got it
Yeah.
wrong. So because of this constant motion, timing is a very important factor. If you want to make good use of the path that this planet takes and basically use it to your advantage, you have to know when the planet is going to be at a particular position in order to basically get to it. Now,
Mhm.
how would we take advantage of its orbit? So, this is where the Hohmann transfer orbit comes into place. Based on the planet's positions, now we know that Mars, which is more further away from the sun than Earth is. So, Mars would basically have a larger orbit because it has to go like a greater distance in order to go around the sun.
Mhm.
So Mars has a larger orbit than Earth. And since it is further, you would essentially, there would be a point where if you are sending something into space from Earth, there would be a point where the ellipse of the Earth kind of intersects with the ellipse of Mars.
Mhm.
And that is probably the golden moment that you want, where you basically shift an object from the Earth's gravitational pull into Mars's gravitational pull. Now, another thing that we know, just, basic physics, is that when you throw something up and you're throwing it in like an arc or a curved motion, even a ball, let's say you toss it in the air, it would go up with a good force, which is the initial force that you're giving it. And then just as it gets on the top, it slows down just as it gets to the curve. And then it would like drop all the way back, right? There's a little bit of that initial force, the slowing, and then the speed that it picks up from that. And those are the concepts that are also applicable in space as well. So when you have the Earth sitting at the center, and then you look at Earth's orbit, you are sending out something into space, a satellite. You give
Mhm.
it an initial boost so that it speeds up the first part of the orbit. And then, due to the natural curve of the ellipse, it kind of goes down like a lazy river path where it
Mhm.
doesn't really have to put any effort and you don't have to give it the fuel because it's already got the
Momentum.
yeah, and now it's
Yeah.
just kind of cruising through the curve of it. Now, depending on how much of an initial boost that you give, it will determine how wide is the ellipse or the path that it's following.
Mm.
And what you want to do is basically just give enough of a boost so that the ellipse gets a little bit wider and just enough so that it bumps into the ellipse of the orbit of the other planet. Because now you're
Mhm.
moving from a smaller orbit to a higher orbit. And then if you do it at the right time and at the right place, you would have Mars itself orbiting around that same position. So then the rocket doesn't really have to do a lot in order to reach the planet because it's pretty much just met the planet in its own
Yeah.
path.
It's been like thrown into the orbital path of Mars.
Exactly, yeah. Without a lot of effort, like there was just that initial boost, which is the initial use of the fuel, and then it came into the orbit, and then it just went, okay, woo, like now I'm just gonna cruise my
Yeah.
way through.
And then you
And
just need
then
the fuel to land.
pretty much, yeah, you just need the
Yeah.
fuel to realign it and then get it to you
Down
know,
onto the planet. Yeah.
exactly. The things we're saying right now is, I suppose, really, really simple and like layman terms, but there's a whole deal of math and physics going
Mm.
on within the calculation. And this was one of like the biggest concerns because I think just before, as I mentioned, they had some initial weather turbulence and just different kinds of issues happening, which might have delayed their process of when they gave that initial launch for the mission, and that could have greatly affected when the satellite would have exactly met Mars in its orbit. And anything could have been a risk at that time, but luckily, their calculations were on track, and this is why there's so much less fuel being used because you really didn't need a lot if you're just going to manipulate the pathways that are already existing in space.
Mm.
So, this little bit where you get an object to transfer from one orbit into another, well, that is the Hohmann transfer orbit. That's a very known and it's also a very like recommended concept that generally people would use in order to do a lot of things within space, whether it's like
Mm.
space missions or just getting from like one planet to another. Well, this is it. Like, this is the kind of speed track or like the express train that you need to catch in order
Mm.
to get the goal.
To make it a reasonable time period to get there.
Pretty much, yeah. It's like,
Because if you just do it whenever, it could take forever.
yeah, exactly. If you can obviously, of course, like the only other way that you can think of is literally launching the rocket from like the surface and expecting it to just go straight into
Mm.
Mars, right? You can take that path, but when
Yeah.
you
But you
have
have
the
you'll run out
option,
of storage space on the craft for the amount of fuel that you need.
pretty much, exactly, yeah, the
Yeah.
amount of fuel that you would use is just ridiculous because we're not talking
Yeah.
about distance between, I don't know, like Sydney and Melbourne. We're talking about distance that we cannot even comprehend.
Mm.
And that's what affects yeah, and that's what makes the Mars orbiter mission so very successful in order that they got it right, they got the math right, and then they were able to make use of what's available, save fuel, and yeah, and just put the resources towards other things, which is like actually get on Mars and start gathering the data. And yeah, that was that. And that was the Hohmann transfer orbit.
Yeah, very cool.
Now, what could the Hohmann transfer orbit be used for? Besides the fact that, of course, this is a space concept and, you know, it's obviously a space
Makes
mission
use
and
of
it's very
space mechanics.
specific.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just the basics of space mechanics. So it's going to be very specific to things in space. So sending satellites to other planets, this is literally, like I mentioned, the go-to method. I believe it's also been used for several missions like Venus, Jupiter, and Saturn, because the further away the planets are, the more you have to be careful about your fuel usage and just whatever you're doing. So I suppose with the efficient calculation, you can just get the planets to align quite literally and send out the satellite and go and study whatever that you want. You could also, within like the space things, this could obviously, you can use it however deep that you want to go. So like deep space probes, probes like Voyager 1 and Voyager 2, which are completely out of our solar systems. If you want to just keep it there, keep it going into space for years and years to come, just to study things way beyond our solar system, this kind of slingshot method is what you want to be using it for. Another thing could be, you know, if you have a satellite that's already orbiting somewhere and you would need another satellite to probably catch up to that. And you might need this for a variety of reasons, you know, space missions where they go into refueling or they need
repairs.
yeah, they need like some kind of repair or yeah, anything that has to be done. If you want the second object to catch up to the path of the first object, then you can kind of get it to like manipulate. It's like basically catching up to a car that's on a speeding roundabout, but then you need to know exactly when to enter it so that you can go and intercept. So yeah, I mean, it's the most fuel efficient way. It's the most recommended way in order to get the transfer orbit done properly. But I was reading about, you know, the fact that since it is orbital mechanics, I suppose there are underlying concepts of it which relate to efficient movement and timing and just energy optimizations that could be applied to aspects outside of space. Not that I've come across it or seen it, but anything between robotic movements or just efficient autonomous vehicle planning, they could use all of these underlying principles in order to basically save resources to get to an efficient way of doing these movements. And I suppose it has to be very specific because again, this is very specific to the shape and the structure as how we know space to be. But there are, I would say, like these concepts can be applicable to many different things wherever mechanics is involved. So yeah, that was the Hohmann transfer orbit and how Ritu Karidhal was able to basically get the mechanics of it down. And she also, as I mentioned, worked on the autonomous brain, the autonomous system of the satellite, of the spacecraft itself. And that was another thing she was appreciated for. But yeah, just a person who's definitely got the nitty-gritties of orbital mechanics down.
Yeah. No, very cool. Is it I have a couple of thoughts. Is that okay? This is the thing that I studied, so I have a couple of
Oh,
thoughts.
yeah, go for it. Yeah.
First of all, very cool. I actually didn't know what that was called. And this is one of those things that kind of falls more under like aerospace engineering. Like it's the like
Yes.
space flight
Yeah.
physics as opposed to like a lot of what I did was more like studying stars and stuff.
Yeah.
But I was just like scrolling through the Wikipedia page
Yeah.
and like the maths is not nice, but it's not the worst.
Yeah.
And like one of the fun things I think about astrophysics and one of the things that make it, I mean, it's not easy, but like help is that like in space, everything's kind of like almost an idealized system where you don't have to consider like things like friction and like there's a lot of stuff that you like don't have to think about because it's in
Right.
space.
It's in space. Yeah, for
But
sure.
as
Yeah.
soon as you put it back on Earth, it's like, oh well, now I have to consider all of these
Consider
other
all of
factors.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
it is interesting, like looking at it's almost like a kind of isolated way to study physics concepts and like yeah, things like velocity and angular momentum and stuff are all very kind of pure in the form that they're expressed in space
Yeah.
systems, and then it gets much more complicated when you actually try and
Yeah.
build it, and you have to take into account all of the stuff that goes into that.
That's fair.
So
Yeah. There's so many
yeah,
things that are, as you mentioned, very ideal because even just this path and that's what makes the concepts so specific to like one case scenario. Like
yes,
you
yeah.
can't really generalize it, which is
That's
what
what I
I
mean, right?
mentioned.
Like you
Yeah.
can't be like, oh yeah, it'll just keep going if we throw it out, like because
Yeah.
if it's on Earth, like it's gonna experience all kinds of other forces,
Oh,
and
very
so
different things. Yeah, for sure.
yeah, so
Um,
super interesting.
Yeah. Another, I don't know if you've ever come across this, but there was apparently a video game called the Kerbal Space Program.
Oh yeah, yeah, classic.
Yeah, a lot of people from the YouTube videos that I was watching in order to teach myself orbital mechanics kept mentioning that they accidentally learnt about the Hohmann transfer orbit because they were playing
Yeah,
the game. And it's so I thought it was pretty cool. And I felt like, yeah, maybe this is something that I want to start experiencing if I ever wanted to get deep dive into space and just concepts of
yeah. I've never
astronomy.
actually played it. A lot of people who I know haven't really like it. It's basically yeah, just like a space flight simulator,
Yeah.
where you can plug in all different like variables and stuff, and then see what paths things take, and yeah, it's pretty
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah. And who knows?
And I
We
think
might be
yeah.
solving very real world problems right now, and you
Well,
could
yeah, people use it at
be.
uni, like for like simulations and stuff. So,
Oh, very cool.
obviously not like original research, but for like
Yeah.
in undergrad, if you're like, oh, I want to see what that like equation looks like in an actual rocket, you can just chuck it in and yeah. My only other thing was that
Yeah.
I think there's quite a big aspect of research in aerospace engineering and that kind of thing is like basically optimizing these orbits, like these strategies, as you're saying,
Yeah.
and making it so that you can like kind of make a chain of planets like
Yeah.
so you go from like one orbit to the
To
next
the next. Yeah. Just like
to like
interstellar
make use
travel.
of the same
Yeah.
effect, and you go around and like how far out can you get by like optimizing the path between the planets and the timing and all
Yeah.
that kind of stuff, which is really
Yeah.
interesting. But
Yeah. That's what I was mentioning. Like one of the applications was just deep space probing. So
yeah,
you just keep going and you just keep
it's like
going.
hop between the different orbits. Yeah,
Exactly, yeah. And then once you're beyond, I don't know, like Neptune and Uranus, like where do you go beyond that?
yeah, and that's
And
where it
that's
gets
pretty cool.
interesting because
Yeah,
yeah, well we can't really monitor stuff like past that point because like the craft gets too far away to send signals back, and so it's kind of like
exactly.
we'll just send it out there and see what happens.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Space exploration is so fascinating.
Anyway, that's my 2 cents.
Oh, thank you for
But
that.
thank you for teaching me about a concept that I was not super familiar with.
Yeah, I hope I did somewhat of a justifiable job.
I
But
think
if
so.
not, I will send you the articles that I read and literally like these summarized videos. I think these kind of things are definitely learned better when you have visuals supporting it rather than
Yeah, for
me
sure.
drawing like air circles right now. But
Yeah.
yeah, I will link them and I think you might get a much better idea just of
Mm.
everything that I've just said if you have like the visual aid to go hand in hand with it. So
Yeah. I feel like
yeah.
similar to last time, like physics stuff is very much often you kind of need that visual aid because
Visual, yeah, for
it is
sure.
like physical systems, and so it can be helpful to visualize it. So yeah, I would
Yeah,
recommend anyone go have a look. There's plenty of like animations and simulations, or you could download Kerbal Space Program and do it yourself if you want.
that too. Yeah, for sure.
Yep.
Well, that is all that I have for you today about Ritu, about the Hohmann transfer orbit, and yeah, a very spacey, physicsy episode for this one. But yeah, for anybody, if Ritu's story got you all inspired, she was just a normal gal interested and looking out into the moon every night and then
Mm.
decided to go and get it. I think that could be a pretty wonderful story. But do let us know what you think, whether we got orbital mechanics right, or if there's any other cool concept in orbital mechanics that we should also know about. Things in space that are way beyond explanation. We love learning.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's why we do this podcast. So we
Yeah,
just teach
for
each
sure.
other.
That's about it from us. See you next time.
See you, everyone.